will be more a kind of visual survey to sort of give you an idea of what are really the urgent issues that are confronting architects or anyone involved in the built environment in the last in the last few decades. But of course, I myself, my expertise is really in the 20th and also particular post-war history and theory and what's happening in architecture and what were the ideas that were developed. So, as you have probably gotten a sense from Tao, his architecture practice or the history of and where ideas come from are not static. They also do not have a single point of origin. There's a lot of intersection of ideas, and there were multiple points of origin. So today I'm just really going to cover a lot of the urgent issues today has to do with something that happened actually a little further back. So I'm going to divide my talk into two parts, and I'm going to count on Jay to kind of give me the time watch because I tend to get really excited about these. So the first part will be really looking at the couple of decades after World War II, what actually happened to the world and how, so that it can give you an idea of why some of these issues not only were they not resolved and almost impossible to still be resolved, but they are still very urgent. So let's start. This is how the world looks today, with the exception of, I don't know how well you can see this. Let's see. The blue refers to all the members of the United Nations, meaning the world today is understood in terms of national identities, nation. Usually people ask you about you define your identity based on nations. Where are you from? China. That's what usually you say that, and there is some assumption that carries with it. There's some exceptions, like these where they are still kind of, they are not sovereign states, so they are still kind of either a US territory or still a French colony and so on. Let's look at how the world became so blue today. Number of things. Of course, there were two wars. I want to focus more on the second one because a number of things still, because that particular war was also understood in many terms, the kind of consequence of the war, including why what we get, the national paradigm of definition of the world is still very much traced back to World War II. What happened in World War II, you see, when the war ends, this was how the world looks like. It's not that blue. It's actually quite colorful. What are the colors? You don't have to worry about this so much for today. It's really a quick background. They are all different colonies, French colonies, the US colony, British colonies, and so on. There was still, the world is still understood up to this point as a combination of nation states, colonies, as well as, I will get there later just to talk a little bit about how the world up to 1990 were understood in three big portions. So very quickly first, so 45, the United Nations, many of you probably know your history better than me. I needed this to foreground for you the issues that follow. Sometime in the summer of 1945, in part owing to this guy called Wendell Willkie, who write this really small book called One World and have a very passionate appeal about how the only way we can kind of move forward and prevent any world wars is to have a kind of global and international governance, a government that can sort of mediate the issues at a global scale. So the United Nations was formed in 1945, and one of the most historic speech was given by then Prime Minister of the UK at the time, Winston Churchill, a very famous speech that he gave in the US in Westminster College in Missouri, where he basically make an argument of the notion of the Commonwealth, that all the what happened, of course, amongst the other things that emerged out of World War II is the victory of the Allied nations. And the Allied nations were really led by primarily the English-speaking USA and the UK, of course, the French and so on as well. But predominantly, post-war 1945 was also really understood as the American sort of face in terms of world powers. So here he was really talking about how the United Nations has to be a kind of fraternal associations. And so I'm just going to read very quickly because it's probably better than. If the population of the English-speaking Commonwealth be added to that of the United States with all that such cooperation implies in the air, sea, all over the globe, and in science and in industry, so you see already territorial, technological, and in moral force, there will be no quivering, precarious balance of power to offer its temptation to ambition or adventure. On the contrary, there will be an overwhelming assurance of security. So this idea, the twin idea of global security as well as freedom, was very much the main kind of slogans or ideas that came out of this this time. Well, it wasn't the world. It didn't become blue so quickly, right? So for over 4 decades, architects was working in the world, depending on which color blocks you are. The world was divided into the communist bloc, which is pink, the developing nations, or they call it the third world, because the communist bloc is understood as the second, and so-called the free world, which is the first world also. And so why this is important? Because it actually does matter for the architects who are practicing within them, that depending on which world ideology they are in, it also affects the kind of architectural production, the types of work they were doing, as well as the ideas that were disseminated. So a lot of the ideas were, there were a lot of exchanges of ideas between the blue, and there were also ideas that the blue brought into the developing nations. You will see that as I go into detail later. And for a long time, until '89, there was, the red blocks were mostly internalized, meaning the kind of architectural production were very much happening within rather than in terms of transfers. This is really general because that's not entirely true, because there were certain architects who were sent out purposefully by the government, say in Russia or in China, to the US, Canada, or Australia, specifically for knowledge gathering and to kind of be trained in the West. And they'll come back and sort of work within the nation, the territory itself. So all these are important consideration when looking at the kind of work that were being produced within this time period. There are a few number of things that were also significant because they affect also architectural ideas and production at that time. One was this notion of the American economic dominance. It was called the European Recovery Program. After '45, Europe was pretty devastated economically. A lot of the cities needed rebuilding. There was a lot of work for architects. Towns needed to be rebuilt, and there were a lot of new housing agendas that came out, housing projects, new towns, and so on, because there were a lot of homes that were devastated. But they were not, because of the war, they had been very devastated economically, so the US came in a way as a big brother, under the watch of President Harry Truman, who basically announced shortly after the war that essentially the US Congress will help the recovery of Europe. So what it did was to pump in it was known as the Marshall Plans. These were all the nations that were helped by the US. to recover. So the U.S. was really the generous Uncle Sam. That's where if you ever heard of Uncle Sam, that's where it came from during this time. This is the U.S. What's interesting is this is the Greek depiction. The Greek benefited most in U.S. aid. I think Greece got $13 billion, if I'm not wrong, which translates to about $130 billion in contemporary monetary terms. So that's literally Greece was getting built from scratch by American dollars. So this was really, so of course the cartoonists in Greece will say, well, you know, Uncle Sam is coming in and be kind of big brother. This is a cartoon that is drawn from the US saying that, hey, Uncle Sam, there's more work for you, go do your work, right? So there's this kind of double perception of what aid means from the point of view of Europe and from the point of view of the American. The other thing that was happening during this era was the crackdown of communism. What this really means was a very divided idea of the world where from the first world point of view, whatever they stand for, fighting against totalitarianism, the democratic ideas and so on was good. Communism was bad. So it's sort of this kind of very simplistic black and white idea of the world resulted in an entire decade, about 47 to 57, of cracking down and persecution of all those who are suspect of being communists. A lot of architects were, don't quote me on this, I know this because I'm very nerdy, but a lot of architects were involved either as spies or actually also kind of called in because some of the projects were understood as being one way or another. So don't think buildings are neutral. Buildings carry a lot of significance in them, and that's why we're learning, because you want to know what you're making is actually what it's trying to say, especially for people who read into building, and even layperson can read into buildings. So the whole so this actually is a really quick background. I want to get into the issues of the contemporary already, and comb through 12 issues. But this is during the period up to the entire Cold War. The Cold War was really, the end of the Cold War was marked by a number of key events, including the fall of the Berlin Wall in 89-90, as well as the opening up of China to the world in the same period, and a few other global issues like in Africa and so on, and the resolution of Vietnam War. There's a whole bunch of resolutions and agreements to kind of, and handshaking to mark the end of the Cold War. So what we're really looking now is in terms of contemporary, in terms of understanding the contemporary in historical time, is we're looking at the last three decades or so, post 1970s. From 1980s, the road towards the first map that you saw, the blue-colored world of independent nations. So that's really the context. Okay, I will not, since Tao already covered a lot on the modern, I just want to do a little recap regarding the modern. The word modern, within the study of architecture and also the understanding of architecture, there implicates a few other kind of longer terms. One is, and I assume that Tao had been spending a lot of time on this word modernity last week, which, and this might be very simplified, but I clarify it for you. That modernity, as we understand it, and a lot of theorists, philosophers, historians have really explored this issue, is really an experience, which means that modernity was experienced in 1900 as as much as it was experienced in 2000 and 2015. What modernity is really a experience of the modern. What the modern is the new, the rejection of the old. If you see the word modernization, it has been often now tied in with development, which actually is not entirely the same. Modernization is a process, the process of modernizing. Often the word modernization is also related to technology and often tied into the word of industrialization. And finally, what we are most concerned with in terms of what we do in architecture schools, in design studios, why we study history and theory, why we study construction and so on, really has to do with this idea of modernism. Modernism is the kind of what is being the response towards modernization and modernity. What is the response? Well, modernism is not only in architecture. Modernism are actually forms of responses. So if you look at modernism in literature, for example, I don't know if there are any literature major in high school and so on, you will see that there's a break in style, there's a break in writing, there's a break between the subject and object matters and so on. Modernism in the arts, you will see very clear break, say in the 1910s and 20s, in how they draw the nature and how they abstract certain ideas. A lot to do with notions of speed, space, new conceptions of time. And so modernism are really different forms in different disciplines that manifest responses to the onslaught of modernization. And they continuously express the experience of modernity. So what were the kind of modernization or advancement that actually have really direct relationship? Now we're getting closer and closer to the heart of the issue of architecture. One is television. Not just the invention of the television, but the mass consumption of television. When television becomes something in which every house, the contemporary equivalent of television, I think I don't need to say, I mean many of you are probably watching it now, I hope you're not, is the iPhone. Or it's a much more accelerated form of media. But what happened after the war ended was that a number of inventions, as technological inventions that were previously military, have become popularized, meaning it's been released for mass consumption. And the kind of technology will also begin to lead into other inventions. For example, and you will see in the 50s onwards, the rise of a lot of multinational corporations that go into the mass media, into various electronics. So the television is one. In terms of speeds, in terms of travel, again, not the invention of the airplane, which of course happened much earlier, but the mass travel. That the first commercial airlines that anybody, not just the military, before that, the airlines that did international travel before 1947 were mostly military or for mail. So after the war, that's when we begin to see commercial travel that if you can afford it, you can travel. And no longer just using the steamliner or by train or by sea. This second phase of shift in speed is very significant. I don't know if Charles covered Corbusier. I'm sure he did last week on space. So what happened before the airplane was commercialized and become a mass something where become a mass consumption commodity was that for architects they were really still imagining its possibilities. But from the 50s onwards, we see how did it affect architecture. If you look at when all the international airports were built across the world, you can actually date them to around 1950s and beyond. You suddenly realize that architects never before had to build airports. Like, how do you actually design airports? It became a new kind of architectural type, architectural building, which is and every time a new architectural type emerges, it is where experimentation can happen. I'm not going into detail for all these today, but just to identify to you that a lot of the, that what as a student of architecture, I'm still one, to learn is that a lot of seemingly large issues that don't seem directly related to architecture at first, if you really look at it carefully, have either direct or very implicit or indirect relationship to architectural ideas, how we think about buildings, how we think about architecture, or how we build. So not only were there airports, then this idea of terminals and the notion also of time, that basically if you had to take a few months before to travel from one place to another, now it's a matter of hours. What this really means to the understanding of cities. Another phenomenon right after the war is mass production. Again, many of these, it wasn't the war that suddenly this idea of mass production appeared, but these ideas were already much, after World War I, they already started thinking about that. The first kind of mass-produced cars were in the turn of the 20th century, so it was a few decades ago. But what happened in after 1940s was that there was much more technological know-how, and also, if you think about it, the war had also been very effective in fine-tuning the mass production process because they had to build ammunitions really fast. And also tankers and all the kind of things related. They have to mass produce these. So the mass production process was much more streamlined. What this means for architects during this time in the 50s was, how do we think about that when the war's over? How do we harness the technological knowledge of mass production? So what this time was matched with was the huge demand for housing. A lot of people need homes. So a lot of the experimentation was happening in home building. Like, how do we build a home cheap and fast? So all different experiments. This one, which still survives today if you visit Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or New York, which is actually Levitt are two brothers who are developers, and they came up with a way to build a very quick mass-produced house in 2 weeks. And it costs a few $1,000s. This is an advertisement from the brochure to show you that, you know, it can house a very happy family of 5, and you can get it for a few $1,000s for, and it can be constructed in a number of weeks. There were much more radical experiments like this, which is designed by a really crazy architect, engineer, mathematician figure called Fuller, who got a grant to experiment on how do you use the exact same process that the Ford car. Ford is the first car manufacturing company in the U.S. How does the whole industrial process of producing a car, how can it be used to produce a house? So what he did was went into Ford factory and started to use the same process, but the output of it is not a car, but a house. So this was a prototype that he developed in 1949. There were others, there were many in the 50s who were experimenting, not just architects, developers, because it's really, In fact, developers did a better job selling theirs than the architects. A lot of the architects' one remain as prototypes. They were very experimental. This other architect worked with a few others to come up with a whole bunch of manufactured homes, they call it, where a little bit different from this. This was using the exact material that Ford used for the cars. This was really looking at the different industrial materials that were coming out, that were being mass produced very fast, like 4x8 plywood, very quick aluminum parts, corrugated pieces, and all the different materials and technology, and how do you quickly assembly them and to tap into the manufacturing expertise. So as you can see, that it wasn't just the invention of the automobile industry or so on, but they actually really trickle. Architects were really constantly seeking for what is happening in the world, and also the currency of the urgency of what's happening around. So this is an example of these houses. It's not only at the scale of the building, but this is the entire area of Levittown. This is, so each of these houses is this one. And basically it's what you see, mass production house. That's how you look like. Everyone equally spaced apart. Each one has a front lawn and a back garden. The house can be built in a few weeks. What this means is it also changes the face of what the city looked like. 1950s for the US and for certain parts in Europe was a massive phase of suburbanization. Okay, marching forward, what other inventions came about that were still perpetuating? The skyscraper, except they were much lower than. For a number of reasons. Technologically, in the 50s, they couldn't figure out that high yet. So one of the most famous ones, which you will encounter later in the architectural study, is the one in New York by a very famous German architect, Mies van der Rohe, the Seagram building. What is significant in this building isn't so much just the design, or the, and I will not get so much into detail with that, but the fact that in order to get this high, something has to be traded off. And this is what is interesting. Because when we are looking at architecture, especially in the urban, we cannot think of it in itself. We have to think of it in the context of the neighborhood, the area, as well as the entire city. What this project did, which was why it was considered modern and a break from previous high-rise building. Think about it, the Empire State Building was pretty high. It was higher, actually. The Chrysler Building was even higher. So why is this so significant? Was the fact that of the public plaza in front, that the ability to go high was a trade-off to offer the public plaza on the ground. So what you see in cities it happens in Hong Kong too. Go take a look around. That this is a kind of exchange between the owner of the building and the city. This is a trade-off. So if you go high, what you have effectively done is you are dominating the city skyline. Which means that something has to give back. So of course, if you historians have looked at this building and analyzed it in terms of technology and so on and so forth, which is completely also very accurate analysis. But I want to draw your attention to something that's less discussed, which is really the relationship between high rises and the city. I will get more into that also towards the end. Okay. As I'd shown you earlier, after 1947, over 100 nations in the world became independent nations. Before that, they had no idea that they were their own place. So this question of identity was huge from the 40s onwards. India, Singapore, Singapore was 60s. India, certain of the African nations, all over the world, the newly independent nations were trying to kind of built its national identity. Architecture plays a very big role because it is visual, it is spatial, it is also habitable. It's for people. So it plays a very huge role in participating in the national identity, the building of the nation. And a lot of books have been written about that, looking at different nations and how architecture play a significant role in it. I'll give you an example of this which you will also encounter probably in the next few years. This is a new capital called Chandigarh, which was commissioned by the Prime Minister Nehru. And this was the master plan, and what was actually you are seeing here by this Swiss-French architect Le Corbusier is the capital of the entire newly planned city of Chandigarh. What you see is a very rational Cartesian grid, 90 degrees, in which you can understand the logic of movement around it. It is also spaced very far apart to anticipate a modernized infrastructure, modern way of traveling, mainly by the car. And the landscape runs in the rational way inserted within it, right, you see. And what Corbusier focused his attention on was how to begin to, he's coming from, a Swiss-French tradition, coming to somewhat a kind of more tropical, arid tropical condition, tasked to build modern symbols, things that are on the one hand modern, but also respectful of the cultural tradition. So this became for him a way to test out some of the ideas that he had of how to kind of manage modernism, modern architecture, and local conditions. So for him, one of the main experiments were in how to deal with the facade, the skin of the building, how to make the building breathe. So there were a lot of tests on that. So till next time. I feel that since we are where we are, it's important to also show you what was happening at the same time in China. The same process was going on, even though this is internal. Whereas India was a new colony, it became a colony in the late 40s, independent nation in the late 40s. It didn't quite have its own master architect that Nehru felt could really give it the symbolic identity. So he invited a foreign architect to come and sort of participate in the design of a new national identity. In China's case, in the 50s, something was happening simultaneously. It was a kind of consolidation, post-1949, reconsolidation of China as an identity. So one of the first major acts was to enlarge Tiananmen Square. So in the 1950s, Tiananmen Square was significantly enlarged from, if you look at like 50 years before that, it was a lot smaller and still very vernacular looking. But Tiananmen Square was modernized, the wall was reconstructed so that it looks like a modern structure, even though it was a 400-year-old structure. And same thing in the 50s, housing was very significant. The rise of public housing. Public housing is a very new phenomenon. Across the world, public housing is less than 100 years old. So we always feel like public housing is a lot older than we think, but it's a very new thing. And public housing all over the world was really consolidated in the 50s as well. So you can see why it's important, and we're very fascinated with this period because all these same issues are very with us today. So modern architecture, or at least the idea of the modern aesthetic, the kind of clean understanding of repetition, the geometric resolution of the design, and so on, became the main, shall I say, stylistic, the aesthetic for most of this housing project, mainly because there's this idea that they're quick to build, very easy to rationalize. You can lay it out, you can subdivide all the housing units in a very rationalized way. So for all the housing designers and architects, this kind of modern look, modern design makes a lot of sense to roll out a lot of housing projects. So this is in the US, this is in Hong Kong. The housing program really started in the late 50s. Okay, finally, we get into the 60s where mass media, and this is what we're talking about now, is extremely significant. What does this mean? This means that not only do we know our own identity, but there's an understanding that the world is one home, one place. And how is this possible? If you ever heard of the word global village, it was coined in the 60s and popularized in the 60s. And it really suggests that, you know, even though you probably in your entire lifetime will never go there, we don't even know where that is, somewhere in Papua New Guinea or, you know, somewhere out there in some lost island. But because of mass media, we know that we are, even though we're in Hong Kong, very high dense, very modern, we know that this is the same world. So the entire world is simultaneously in your home, in your phone, a fingertip away. So there is a kind of idea that the entire world is one big village. So because of that, what did architects learn about this? 50s, 60s, the rise of cybernetics. The first IBM computer came up in the late, in 48, I think, or something. And architects were very fascinated also. First of all, there are millions of architects in the world. So when I say architects, there are different architects picking up on any one of these issues or more that I have talked so far, and devoting their life work or their whole work around these ideas. So there are a few that actually started exploring into cybernetics and network technology and so on, and how do they actually sort of inform human experience. So this is an experimental theater meant for London. There were others that were even much more fascinated, not only with the kind of technology, cybernetics, computer knowledge of understanding of bits and data, but also with mass media, with mass culture. So in this case, these architects were really interested in not just technology, but also popular culture. So you see, this is an example of what if cities can walk. Okay, how am I with time? I have no sense of when this class ends.
Around 12:50.
Oh, okay, I'm good then. I'm halfway. This is the halfway point. A little over halfway. Okay, so all these things, the 60s is a fascinating thing, and if you're in architecture class, you will get actually a lot of weeks on the 60s as well. But what we're going to look at is from the 70s to now, all right? Okay, sometimes in 1972, it's a very precise time. I think, what was it, 8 something a.m. in the morning. There was a newscast because everyone had a TV now, right? Not just in the living room, but in every room in the house. Watching the morning news, and one of the first image they see is the collapse of this. I don't know if you guys, the demolition of this. If you guys remember, that's this project. So this project, when it was built in the 50s, won a lot of awards because the project was built in a previously slum area, very ghettoish, a lot of crimes, poverty. It was a very, it's basically African Americans, and it was just, so this project was seen in many ways to be a social project because it was meant to sort of clean up the area. It didn't quite do it. So between 1951, when it was built and won all kinds of awards, and 1972, what happened was the areas around it, the neighbors around it, started moving out. And the building very quickly, by the 60s, fall into disarray. There were more crimes coming back in, and graffiti everywhere, and there was not sufficient maintenance and policy and so on, to such an extent that the city needed to do something about it. So in 1972, it started to demolish the first section of it, and incrementally over time started demolishing it. So this, for a British historian, he's a theorist called Charles Jenks, become a reason for him to use as to announce that actually modern architecture is dead. So I want to pause in memoriam that modern architecture in 1972, 16 March, died. Why did he say that? Well, he said, think about it. Modern architecture, he wrote a whole book explaining why modern architecture died. And the reason why he wrote that book is he wanted to explain what are the new architecture that is happening in the 70s and forward that has very different ideals. So what he said was, the kind of modern architecture like this project carried within them this big idea of the improvement of society, that modern architecture was amongst other things, also a social project, a project where the modern architecture can improve the area maybe, or can really make us a better person, or can really bring the community together. All these really social ideals of, and also on the symbolic level, it can really stand for a kind of a democracy even. And there are a lot of projects in the US that were put forth as democratic architecture. So what he said was, let's take a look at around us how many of these modern projects that make this claim of the social actually worked. So they didn't, they failed. So that became a launching pad for him to then start looking at to start talking about what is going on around us. So after this slide, I'm going to start looking at the 12 issues very quickly. So, but this is a transition. The year after this was the architect for this is the same architect for this. This and this. So Minoru Yamasaki, who was the architect for the Pruitt Eagle housing project in Missouri, his project failed. Not because of the architect, even though the architect often got blamed for all failures when it comes to buildings. Buildings are a lot of other people were involved and complicated. What happened in the 70s, we see, amongst other things, a very different phase that the world was going through. So I cannot cover them all in this time, but one of the biggest things was this notion of the world that was reconsolidated. In the 1970s, the United Nations called for multiple meetings. Why? Because there's a new consciousness of the world, including world trade. So in the 1970s alone, over 50 World Trade Centers were built in the world. We only know this few actually, but I found out there are actually a lot. And World Trade Center is meant every city who is up to the level of able to compete like a metropolis in the world stage will have a World Trade Center. Hong Kong has a World Trade Center that was built in the late 70s as well, in Causeway Bay. Not as high as this one. So a lot of the major cities have World Trade Centers in the 1970s. What the World Trade Center do in terms of its use was really the headquarters of all the kind of trade intersections, trade and commerce. So it's really the kind of control center for world trade. So that's what it's supposed to do. So there was, in the 70s, a whole kind of a new consciousness of architecture in relation to the global. Another thing was the environmental awareness that the United Nations called an urgent meeting. I believe it was in 73 once and in 76 to discuss the environment of the world, ecology, because there was somehow a report released that the ozone layer was depleting, and there were all these other consciousness that what is happening somewhere else. The age of the Anthropocene, if you ever heard of this word, meaning man's action someplace in the world is causing a reaction somewhere else. And everything is interconnected. So this awareness, so you see the whole period before the 70s of national identity, we're all consolidating our own identity. Suddenly in the 70s, there's a different awareness that it's not just about my country, that actually what I'm doing. So including the oil crisis in the 70s and so on. So these two major ones started, so national governments, the United Nations started to kind of come up with a new imperative, urgency, and held a lot of meetings and so on. And these are things that haven't gone away. What the kind of things that were occurring in the 70s are only really seeing its repercussions now. For example, the oil crisis is still very much fundamental, for example, to what was happening to the world in the last 15 years in terms of global terrorism and so on. So they are really connected. Why this is important, I don't have an image of this being demolished. You guys probably know what happened in 2001 when the Twin Towers were hit by two planes within an hour of each other, and it's no longer there. That's the architect who's, very proud, standing there with his tallest tower in the world. Okay. So let's look at contemporary issues. One, history. History came back in some very fiercely from the 70s. History is always there, but history in the consciousness, up to this point, a lot of architects, especially those trained in thinking about modern, must be kind of new, must be different, reject the old because the old is bad, or the old is messy, dirty. History came back in a number of different forms, including everyday, learning from the everyday life, learning from the people. So it's not just history in terms of I'll show you a few examples. One is history in terms of the contemporary, look behind your backyard, go out and look at the street and learn from them. So there's a whole group of architects in the 70s who are really learning from the everyday, the grassroots, the people. And then there are, this is the contemporary example. I don't know who have been to the Venetian, it's by Ines. You have, I should bring my daughter there. I think kids will like it. What you see in the 70s, these are examples, there are a lot of examples, was to bringing back the quotation of history, quoting history. So in this case, this is actually just the plaza of a shopping mall. I cropped out the shopping mall because the shopping mall would look like any typical skyscraper. But what the architect decided is that for people who are entering the shopping mall, let's give you some references from history. So we have, I counted, there are over 10 different styles from the last 1,000 years, going to Italian Renaissance to all kinds of Romanesque and different kind of references, and used in a very different way, used in an unexpected way. The historians of the classics will turn in their grave, But this was the kind of, why? Because architects realized that one of the issues that they learned from the generation before them was that they felt modern architecture in the way that they were stripped down and minimal, were not relating to the everyday person. Not, ask your mom, do you think that they think Knowles building is really nice, My mom doesn't get it. But the everyday person, the person who actually uses your space, the guy who goes shopping in the mall, gets it when they look at, kind of historical, so on. So architects began to realize that, and to start responding, learning from so-called the mistakes, or learning from their precedents. But those were just one types of architects. Let's go the other extreme, where there are architects who say, so architecture architecture really cannot solve social problems, So why try? We have a lot to worry about in architecture itself, how to get it to stand up, how to build it. There's a lot of issues. Architecture, the building itself is already more than enough and complex. How can we even, how can architects even have the ability to deal with that? The sociologists do it, right? So there is a whole group of architects. This is the second issue. Even though I'm showing you a mix of examples that are in the last, between now and the past, all these 12 issues still exist with us. I'm just showing you a bunch of examples. So those who deal with autonomous, thinking of architecture as its own, anybody not know what autonomy is? Autonomous? Yourself? In that it doesn't need to refer to anything else but itself. Autonomy, independence. So architects like Peter Eisenman built a series in the 70s. He designed 10 houses, and each one were mathematical experiments, trying to figure out how to deal with geometry, structure, and construction. And this house was actually built in Vermont, which is in the East Coast of the US. And as you can see, he came out with the house first, and based on a set of mathematical principles and geometric experimentation. And then figure out what was the kitchen and the different spaces, and try to see how do you then start putting the bedrooms and so on. This kind of approach towards architecture is still very prevalent. The fact that for some architects, they didn't feel that it's that necessary to deal with a lot of other issues that architecture cannot solve anyway. How about dealing with architecture's own issues? And for them, it is materials, construction, form, style, and so on. Another example from Eisenman, where in the 80s, he experimented with the grid. How do you play around with the grid? How do you kind of understand the city as a kind of geometric grid? And then how does the architecture break the grid as a kind of experiment of experience? So for example, in this particular project, he had worked out the main kind of project complex as a kind of 90 degrees grid. And for the circulation, the passage through it, cut a diagonal grid to kind of break it, to deconstruct the grid. And by doing that, he created a series of kind of surprising or unexpected spaces that this kind of diagonal grid created. So this was for him a very particular formal exercise, play with space. Another architect, there were many. I'll show you some really classic examples, and they were also our teachers. This was this particular. I didn't name it. This particular house is called the Wall House, also of the 1970s by John Hader, who is now passed, but he was for a long time the dean of the Cooper Union School in New York. And for him, he was really, this is a drawing for it. This is called the Wall House, and he was really testing the wall, the 90 degrees geometry with this kind of more organic forms, and really experimented with that. He had a series of drawings on how the straight line and the curve and the geometric and the organic could be composed together. So it's a series of composition in itself. Actually, okay, this is 2, so sorry, I blocked it, but this is 3. The third issue that is still very prevalent is the question of the region. In Hong Kong sense, it will be the Pearl River Delta. So not only was it the understanding of, so architects don't only think in terms of national boundaries anymore, like, but in terms of what the region offers. The region, because before the nation, there is an understanding, for example, Malaya was a region. But after independence, there's Malaysia, there's Singapore. But yet there are a lot of shared resources, and including climate, temperatures, vegetation, the kind of materials like certain kind of woods, teak and stone that was shared in the region that actually define national boundaries. So there are a number of architects that were very interested in recovering what are the kind of regional kind of qualities in order to inform their architecture. So in China, there are more and more architects, including Wang Shu and others more famous ones, who are really looking at what regional qualities can offer to their architecture. This is an example by a very famous architect, Finnish architect from Finland, who designed a really modest town hall, and his reference are from all the kind of local barn houses, farmhouses that were in the area. So even though this is a modern project, but he derived the kind of spaces and the form, as well as the material and the wood that he used from the region, from the local area, as well as from the local expertise. The carpenters also has the same knowledge. Those who built the farmhouses were the similar ones who actually were building this. So there's in Australia, there are many architects also that work along these lines. At the same time, there are those in Southeast Asia and other areas that were really thinking of the region, not just in terms of materials and so on, but also in terms of symbolism. And also in relation to climate. So you will see this, this is in Sri Lanka in the 80s, and the reference to the kind of big roof because of the very strong sun and so on, and for ventilation and so on. 4, technology. So 70s, 80s, all the way to now, there is already after the war, you can see a belief in technology. That technological advancement, innovation is something that inform and underlie all architecture schools in the world. That basically, so you can really think about it, including the transition from drawing by hand to the computer, to you being able to draw in the computer, to letting the computer script the design, so you just punch in the program, to robotics. Like the whole kind of belief that architecture can harness technology is still here and very prevalent. In the 70s, there were many experiments thinking about technology. The most extreme ones are those like this, who actually begin to see technology in the building as the systems. So you see, you look around here, right? You don't see the air conditioning ducts and all the things that actually are required in the modern building. What some of these architects did was to show you what it takes to actually run the building. These are all the things, the pipes, the air conditioning ducts, the water, sewage, everything. And to show you that actually this is the technology that that runs the building. So this is a very famous example, Centre Pompidou in Paris. Closer to home, in the 80s, we get the HSBC, which was really an expression of structural integrity, and the entire building was presented as a technological response to the high-rise building. So rather than showing you a skyscraper as the ones that just show you the glass skin and you don't know how it's held up, what the architect in this case, Foster, was to actually show you exactly how the building is held up, how it held itself up, how it was constructed, how it was clean. You will see that these are the cleaning devices. And these actually are where the forces are to resist wind load, and these are the bricks so that the building is thought of in sections so that it can resist the wind pressure from the two directions. And you also see the elevator, express elevator running up. I don't have an internal view, but internally you will also see the giant escalators that run throughout. So how the building operates, how it held up, how it's constructed is completely presented to you. No hiding. More contemporary, so we are actually a little bit past this phase. You know, this was happening in the 80s, a little bit in the 90s, and after that architects say, you know, you don't really need to show off technology like that. Let's harness technology differently. So we see projects like this. There are many that basically use the computer as a tool to produce forms that otherwise the hand cannot do. You cannot draw this in 3 dimensions. You can, however, the computer could 3-dimensionally help you to kind of produce the kind of forms and volumes. At the same time, in China, we get already houses that are completely printed by the computer. This is actually been rolled out already, as far as to remember, in the last 2 years. So these are completely produced by the computer. What's really interesting is that these are really very, very different kind of architecture. So you see that technology has been, it has a very different look from this attempts to express technology. Here, technology becomes much more integrated into the production of the project. So in this case, sorry, it's the process of producing it. If you look at the architecture itself, what does it remind you of? Something, is it modern? Not. What is modern is in the process of producing this project. Similar for this, that what is producing it is extremely kind of modern technology that wouldn't have been possible before. Number 5, I'm a little bit slow, so I'm going to speed up. Infrastructure. Hong Kong is very, very good, offers many, many good examples. From the 70s onwards, it's major building projects in Hong Kong cannot be conceived without thinking about infrastructure. The NPR is a very big collaborator in this. So an example here is the Waterloo Station, where you see that, look at this, this is an entire kind of station that is both architecture and infrastructure in one. So is it a building or is it a train track? It's architecture and infrastructure. Other examples, a little bit 20 years ago, this is very advanced 20 years ago, actually. I remember studying this as a student. That you see, is this a park? Is this landscape? Or is this a pier? Or is this a terminal? What we see now is a trending, and that has already been set in place for a few decades, but intensifying, of thinking of the scale of building in relation to the scale of architecture and landscape. They are much more integrated than ever before. Number 6, ecology. I had told you that earlier that the environment and the consciousness of the environment and ecology has also produced multiple reactions. These examples may be very weird to you, but there are many examples. So for example, this was a memorial that was produced to basically memorialize all the thousands of victims that died because of the potato famine in 2 centuries ago in Ireland. There are a lot of Irish people in New York, so this actually was supported by the Irish population. And what is really kind of particular was this is not just memorial, it's a living landscape, meaning every time you go, it's growing. It's not a static landscape. It's actually, there are different plots of, it's really a little farm. It's an agricultural, so they are growing different things in here. And every season, every month you go, it's a different. So it's a living memorial. Underneath, you see that it is a building. So is this a building, a monument, a landscape? And it really came about to memorialize an ecological disaster. Other issues about memorial, about 13 years ago, this was a really kind of experiment of this building, if without the mist, it's actually just a frame. I should have shown you the frame, but actually it's called the Blur Building. And unlike a typical building, it's a pavilion. And unlike a typical building where you actually have the walls, the wall of this building, or the enclosure of this building is water vapor. So everybody has to wear a raincoat to go into this building. It's a temporary building, so it's not there anymore, right? Yeah, I think it's taken down. It's in the middle of the lake in Geneva, and it was for the Expo, National Expo. So what was very particular for this particular architects was they were trying to experiment with something that comes from the natural element of water vapor, the kinds that form clouds, to use it to basically create the form of the building. So otherwise the building doesn't have a form, it only have a skeleton. These are just very little examples of all the kind of rising consciousness of architecture's participation in the environment and its critical role. 7. The urban and the country. The contemporary understanding of urbanization is very different from 50 years ago and very different from the turn of the century. The understanding now of the urban is very much a kind of, literally the urban is everywhere. This notion of the country versus the urban, which was an earlier idea, is fast disappearing. So we see China is a really good example, but we see in many places in the world where the countryside is no longer kind of a neat bounded nature versus the city, but that they are both kind of coexisting. So the urban in this in the rural poses important challenges for architects, and many architects, including some of the professors you're studying with, have made it their problem, their work, their life's work. One example of trying to understand the rural and trying to test it out in the urban. This is an experiment. I had spoken with the architects. They said they were really trying to understand the Toulouse. The Toulouse was very much a rural thing. The reason why they were round and they were so few windows and they were so fortress-like was because they want to keep out the wild animals, keep out the enemies, and so on. They were built from a different time. What happens when you learn from something that is built in a different time, in a different kind of rural condition? What can you learn about them when you think of them in an urban context? This was something, and how can they then offer you possibilities to think back about the rural? There are many architects working with these problems. 8. The skyscraper is not going away. In fact, it's getting scarier than ever. So the world is in this crazy race, and it doesn't look like it's going to stop. So, of trying to compete for the highest, the tallest, and you see the last 10 years, cheating going on. They started putting antennas. A lot of cheating going on. 9. Cultural institution. In the last 10 to 15 years, starting with this one, I would say, amongst others, that put the museum on the global stage. So suddenly the museum is not just, the national museum or the local museum where you show your own, where you show local arts or modern arts that travel and so on. But the museum become this cultural institution that is the identity of that place. Anyone has ever heard of Bilbao? Anyway, before this museum, I've never heard of Bilbao. And I also had no intention to go to Bilbao. But in 1997, when Frank Gehry, the American architect, built this project, suddenly Bilbao became on the world stage. So think about China, for example, and all the examples. London, same thing. Not only the cultural, but point 11, preservation. The idea of how many preservation students here? ACP? You don't have any ACP students? Okay, well, architectural heritage is a huge issue, very contemporary. A lot of us do not necessarily work with projects where you get the open land and just build. A lot of architectural projects now require you to deal with existing and historical conditions. So what does it mean? What do we need to teach ourselves in order to understand how to integrate the new and the contemporary in the old? So this was an old turbine station that became a modern art museum. Oh, sorry, this should be not 10, but 12. Community participation. Getting the community to participate in architecture. This was also a very very contemporary issue that came out also from the 70s when it became important to learn from the people. How does architects work with the community to produce meaningful projects that they actually want to live in? Finally, public space. The question of public space and architecture and its role in the city. This particular project is, when it was built, it was very famous. Oh no, I didn't label it. It's by a German architect called Jürgen Meyer. It's about 7 or 8 years old, and it was really just a public square. What happened was in 2011, there was a huge protest, very similar to Occupy Hong Kong, and where suddenly this architecture that was meant to be a nice public plaza become a place for protests. So architecture's role in public space and in public realm is also a very significant one, and many of your seniors here are also working with this problem, this issue. So just to end with Hong Kong, because it's important, this question of public space. So we see this, and as architects, what do we think about this? Politics aside, what this has actually shown is that what was previously designed as infrastructure, the street and the highway, do you still see the highway? Has completely become a public space. In a city where public space is always negotiated, you get some public space here and there, you get some parks after all. What is really interesting is some architects had already responded to this event and make an argument for pedestrianizing Central, because they said, look at what has happened over the few months in which what was previously designed for the car has been overtaken by people, and it has shown that the city can really do with rethinking what its public spaces are, its environment. My time is up, so I want to end with just 3 questions. These are the 3 questions that sum up everything. What kind of new knowledge and collaborations do this kind of complex? Architecture is no longer just some simple buildings. You have to work with a lot of knowledge and with a lot of collaborators. What new forms of social responsibilities do architectures take on? Like, what kind of architects and what kind of social responsibility? And finally, what do we do with those buildings that were modern? Because modernism keep going, modernity continues, development keep continuing. These are questions of history and heritage. So I'm going to leave with that.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Singh.